Today was our best episode yet. Really tons of insights. Jeremy Schwach joined us from Miami. He built an amazing healthcare business, consulting healthcare system, scaled that to over 400 people, sold it. Now he's doing it again. And we just learned so much from tracking his journey. We talked about Young Presidents Organization, or YPO, which he's a member of, and the value he gets out of that. Also talked about the differences between a product and a service business, which he really loves service businesses and has been able to successfully scale them, and had some disagreement on that. And we talked about how he got his first customers and what it took to get those customers, and how he would go about building a new business today, which he's doing.
The water's fine, homie, jump into the deep end. Sow it, you will reap it. We talking how to start it, how to grow it, how to keep it. Take a deep breath. You are now rocking with Founder Secrets.
We're live.
All right, welcome.
Thank you.
You flew in from Miami.
I got 24 hours here.
How many hours of sleep did you get last night?
It's like 4. I've been retired for 2 years, and I'm just like starting the next thing. And you always glamorize. I remember when I sold the last company, I was like, I am never doing this shit again. And now I'm like, I'm ready to go. I miss it so much. And then, 4 hours of sleep on a plane in New York. I'm like, why? Why? Now I remember. It's too late, though. I'm already raising. I'm stuck.
It's like, wait a second. I don't have to do this. So we met through YPL, and which is Young Presidents Organization. Is this organization we talked before on the pod about another similar organization called EO. And I think it's incredible that it brings awesome people together, and that's how I met you. But also, like EO has this group of forum, and so, I mean, you flew in besides for the pod. You flew in for the forum, and I'm curious kind of what value is that brought to you over the years, and what do you think is worth for other entrepreneurs?
So forum for your mass audience is a bunch of people that come together on a regular basis and are very open with the conversation. So in some ways, it's basically group therapy for CEOs. Mm-hmm. And so I've been meeting with the same group for 5 years, 4 hours, 9 times a year in person. So it's like a pretty serious commitment, but you're also able to like really open up about stuff. So it's been a really powerful, it's actually one of the best things I've done for my career, because when else can you just cry in front of a group of people, right? As a CEO, basically never, but I feel very comfortable crying with this group. So it's a pretty intimate, like amazing experience.
Yeah.
How often have you cried at your forum?
Yeah, I have cried once. We had a coach that we brought in Miami, and he asked these deep questions.
Love it.
That it just like made me cry. It was very unexpected. So yeah.
When's the last time you cried?
We had forum yesterday.
Did you cry?
I'm trying to think. I did not cry yesterday, but I
didn't go
yes,
deep enough.
But I've definitely cried in forum. But before we go much further, Jeremy, why don't you give kind of an overview of your last business? Like, what did you guys do, and when did you sell?
Totally. So started my career at a company called Epic. They're the largest electronic medical record company in the land, founded by one human. And she's still the CEO, Judy Faulkner, now one of the richest self-made females in the world. And out of Epic, I met my co-founders, and we decided, hey, there's a lot of really good Epic talent in the world, and healthcare systems desperately need this talent to install their electronic medical records and make them work for their doctors, that sort of thing. Wouldn't it be great if we could build a platform that connected these individual consultants with the health systems that desperately need them? And that failed miserably. So we raised a little bit of money for that. We were trying to build a two-sided platform as a bunch of 26-year-olds who knew nothing. And it turns out two-sided platforms are basically impossible. You need a ton of money. It's like a lot of stroke of genius. It's sort of winner take all. Like there can't be a lot of, we didn't know any of that because we're not the smartest, tools in the shed. So that failed miserably. But out of the rubble, we said, look, the whole goal here was how do you keep the quality bar high of these people who are going into health systems and doing the stuff that makes modern healthcare actually run. And we said we could probably figure out how to do this like the old-fashioned way. So we built a staffing firm, like very unsexy, but super focused in the area we knew. That worked. We pivoted from staffing into more strategic consulting, so competing with Accenture, Deloitte, mostly because our clients started asking for more stuff. So it used to be, give me this certain type of analyst for 6 months because someone's on maternity leave, and then it became, hey, my physicians in the emergency room are just, they're complaining because there's too many clicks and it's not optimized for how they want to work. So we sort of built a consulting company that worked. And then we sold the company in 2019 to Providence St. Joseph Health. They're a $26 billion health system. And they had sort of a big vision to build kind of a commercial platform attached to their 52 hospital health system. So that was the journey.
So that would you characterize that business as a service business?
The fancy word is tech-enabled services. That's how you get the money.
AI-enabled services.
Right, yeah.
Right,
lots of really cool, fancy stuff behind the hood. No, it's like the most boring, like straightforward service business in the world.
As an investor, you also did some angel invested. Do you invest what percentage into tech-enabled services versus not?
Both, actually. So here's sort of my thesis on the difference. One, I'm not smart enough to build like a tech company, so that's why I didn't do it. But if you're building a tech company, you're making some big gamble in the future. You're hiring a bunch of developers. You need all sorts of capital to make that work. And then it's a really hard slog. Like, did you guess the future right? Can you get a bunch of customers to buy this thing that they're going to pay for forever? And if you do that well, then you get like 10 or 15 or 20x on the market, right? You make $1 million, it's worth 20 million. So that is one way to build a business. It's capital intensive, and founders of tech companies that scale generally own a very small percent of their business. But it's fine because they're getting these huge multiples. Service is basically the opposite. You don't have to predict the future. You can be fairly opportunistic. You can make money right away, right? You're not building a whole bunch of tech. If a customer says, hey, can you help me with this thing? You get a bunch of folks together and you go help them with that thing, and you actually make money day one. And when a customer asks for something new, if you're building a software company, you better go figure out how to build new features quickly, and that's hard and takes time. If you're me, you just say yes all the time, and then you go figure out how to execute well. And for your big winning at the end of that rainbow is about 1 or 2x. So you don't have nearly as big exits, but you don't need all the capital, and therefore you own a lot more of the business. So in the last business, I had 2 co-founders, and then we owned the vast majority of the business because we only raised about $800,000 total, and we were doing about $70 million when we sold the business. So I think they're both fine to invest in. I think you've got to be much more capital efficient if you're running a services business, because you can't raise that much money because you have to have a lot more equity because you're going to get a lot less on the back end, but also you don't have to predict the future. So for guys like me, I take the easy road.
Well, you joke you're not smart enough for the easy route, but I'm wondering, do you enjoy that business more?
So the other thing is, if you're building really good SaaS, you're copy and pasting software. I'm imagining how that's work. I don't really know tech, but yeah, copy paste function. Yeah. If you're building services, typically you're dealing with a lot of people, and I do really like that. So Bluetree is 400 some people when we sold, about 600 when I left. And you've got to think about scaling humans and what you want your culture to look like dramatically different than if you got a group of 10 people who are just copy and pasting code.
Yeah, I want to push back on this a little bit. I think that in a way, like operationally, a service business is much harder than a tech business. Right?
Hardcore execution for sure.
Right? So 400 people, I mean, managing 400 relationships and their
Totally.
emotions, and you got to recruit all those people, you got to keep them happy, and at a similar revenue, a tech business may have a fifth of that number of people.
Totally.
So I think that a service business at scale is, in a lot of ways, maybe much harder to run than a tech business at maybe the same revenue.
Totally, yeah. I think operationally and just sort of the people aspect of it do make it more challenging. And that's the thing you have to get good at. I always tell people we weren't super innovative. We didn't have like a cool product. We weren't doing anything like dramatically different than anybody else. We just had a stronger culture and executed better, and that was the whole thing. When we started this business, like a commoditized business in a hyper-competitive space that's growing rapidly, we would compete. We would fill out RFPs. We'd be like one of 300 firms. Like, you never win those, by the way. It's all an inside job. And then towards the end of the market, as sort of customers get more discerning and execution actually matters, and customers start to sort of figure out who the folks are that have figured it out, we would compete with like the same 3 or 4 firms over time. And so I do think the market is smart enough over time to sort of realize that. And then, yeah, it's a hardcore execution. And, our whole game is get the best people, keep the best people. If you do that, you win.
That seems very subjective, right? And maybe you can offer kind of some practical advice on like, what did you really do day to day to keep this culture high performing over the years?
There's I'll maybe start with the tactical side of things. So I think number one, there's a really good book called The Advantage I think Patrick Lencioni, and sort of you don't have to read it. Here's the punchline. Every team's a little bit dysfunctional, and your goal is to be less dysfunctional than your competitors, and then you'll probably win. And like that's how I think about companies. Like we're all a little bit dysfunctional. It's super hard. You get up day to day. You're in the trenches with this group, and if you can figure out how to make that group work together better than your competitors, you're going to win. So at a high level, like that, I fundamentally believe that's true. And then I think there's a lot of ways to sort of build scalable systems where you can hold each other accountable, but also allow people to do their best. And so we got to a point that, fast forward to the end, we literally had like a company psychologist. We had a team called Culture and Development, which was separate from HR. There's like some great reading. Ray Dalio talks a lot about this, the Bridgewater crazy culture they built, where they have 2 HRs. They have like HR High, which is the strategic function. How do you get the best people? How do you keep them? How do you think about getting creative? And you have HR Low, which is how do we not get sued? How do we make sure our processes really work? How do we make sure we onboard? How do we make sure our benefits are good? They're both incredibly important and very different. So it's very hard to find like one HR person that has both of those skills. And I like really love that philosophy. So we sort of broke out our HR. None of this was deliberate. We just like stumbled on this over time, It sounds better when I'm telling the story after the hindsight of 10 years. And so we had a team called Culture and Development, and their only job was get the best people, keep the best people. They don't have to worry about any of the other HR shit. And so that team ended up over time, we had basically a psychologist. We collected feedback every other week from the entire company. Everybody answered 10 questions. They were different questions every single week that sort of rolled up to 10 big sort of engagement measures. And then we collected subjective feedback that we allowed people to give us anonymously. And what we ended up with was a whole ton of, I would say, subjective data on how people were feeling in the given moment. And there was like powerful stuff in there. So if someone was struggling with a manager or the team, 1, we would know about it. And 2, the coach on the other end could anonymously respond and say, hey, it sounds like you're having a challenge with your manager or your coworker, or this thing is going on. Would love to talk to you about it. Would love to sort of work through it. And so all of a sudden, we started seeing leading indicators like what departments were struggling, where we as a company had to do, or we as leaders had to do way better because our people were struggling. So we built sort of whole systems around that. And I think the last thing I'll say, if your culture, if people know you're going to take that information and you're going to use that to make the company better, then they're much more likely to give you that information. And if you can create that environment and people see that work, then you're going to get amazing feedback from the ground, which is one of the hardest things to do as you scale.
What are some, like maybe 1 or 2 of those really punchy questions?
Yeah.
Like when you ask them,
we just used one of the two. We used Office 5. There's Lattice. There's a bunch of these tools. I think all the tools are like very similar. But it was like I respect my peers and they respect me. I believe that we do the best work for our clients, like above our competitors. I believe that we actually believe in our values and don't just talk about them. So it's literally hundreds of those types of questions on anything you can imagine. And those were all like cut out of the box. Like we didn't make any of the stuff up. It was all like, how do you use this tool to, further this culture?
And those are like 1 through 5, like agree to disagree kind of thing.
Totally. And then you could always leave a comment. And then you had the ability to make it anonymous or not.
So how do you know if somebody is a high performer that needs help with something they're struggling with in the culture, or they're actually kind of a bad team player, like a C or D player, but and just complaining, right? How can you tell the difference between those two?
I would say the best thing you can do to get the best people is to make sure you get the right people in the door. Like once people are in the door, the things you can do, you can build a good culture, but they're sort of limited. So like 80% of the game is making sure that you have really good gatekeepers. And so you have to spend a lot of time on that. I will say if you have a bunch of A players who are good at what they do, and then a C walks in the door, those A players will tell you have a C if you will listen. And so that's a lot of the game, right? If you can get a bunch of people that work well together. And so I'll tell you one more sort of anecdote. We paid basically 0 commissions in any role for the first 7 years of the company. We just didn't believe in commission. No sales commission, no recruitment commission. And the philosophy was we should all win or lose together. So our goal is to build a really high functioning team who works together because we believe that's how we're going to win. And if you use commission can be done, I've seen lots of companies use commission very well. We sort of believed, man, if we can get good people and then every incentives are all shared, and if the company wins, everybody wins, then perhaps we can sort of negate some of the bad behavior that comes from credit taking. And so that's what we did. We had no commissions. Most of our targets were built on sort of high-level company or department metrics. Everybody, win or lose together. And then we make sure that we got good people in the door, and then we're quick enough to fire, which is a really important thing as a company.
Very cool. Go ahead.
All right. I think that, you read on LinkedIn, like people talk about A players and C players and D players. And I'm curious about two things. One is, do you believe that people's definitions of A, C, D are the same? And then my second question is, have you ever seen a D player go to an A player?
So the first one, I think, yes, everybody's definition is different, which is why as a company you have to define what that means to you. One of the ways that we did is we talked about A players in the context of behavior tied to values, right? So we had 5 distinct values, and our interview questions, basically everything in the company ran from those values. So one of the values was find the win-win-win, and we would tell the story where in the early days of consulting, we were moving from a time and materials business where we would just say, here's this person at $150 an hour for 40 hours a week for 6 months, whatever, to a new type of business competing with Accenture and Deloitte, where we had to say, hey, we think there's an opportunity in sort of this administrative part of your business to make it better. So we didn't know what the hell we were doing. So we're building, we had one of our first customers, and we put together this proposal with all the pricing, and we jumped on the phone call with the customer CFO of Big Health System. CFO is going through the proposal. He likes what he's seeing. We're sort of answering his questions. We get to sort of pricing, and he looks at the pricing and he goes, I'm assuming travel's not included in this. So like, okay, one, we've really screwed up the pricing on this thing. If like a customer's basically telling you your proposal is cheap, you've done something drastically wrong. It would have been pretty easy for Justin and David on the phone to just say, yeah, that's not included. It's 15% or whatever. But they didn't do that. They didn't think that was the right thing to do. And they knew that in our company culture, that type of behavior would have been rewarded. So you left money on the table for the company, and we were totally fine with that because it sort of fit with the values. And so we would tell that story 8 million times, and then we build questions like in the interview process, like what would you do in this case based on these values? And so everything sort of tied back to how do you get the right people in the door, and so how we define that sort of around values and a bunch of other things. But I would say that's sort of the
Did they sign?
part. They did sign, yeah, and we did a terrible job. This is the other thing. You have to be able to iterate very quickly and take feedback. Like, no one's good at anything the first time they try it, including, in a business.
Have you seen somebody go from a D to an A?
Oh.
Me either. Thank you.
So before we move on, we need to address, usually in our pod, we have an AI corner. We just got to talk about AI a little bit each time.
Oh,
and
no.
One of the theories...
I just told you I don't know anything about tech at all.
Well, one of the ways of thinking is that consulting type services, they require kind of, preparing proposals, writing up docs, doing some, some of this bullshitting that happens, across whether it's emails or document creation, PowerPoint creation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not just, referring to your consulting
Yeah.
business.
No, we're dead
consulting
for
in
sure.
general. Do you think there's any value to that? Or another way of thinking is that actually there's going to be a huge boom in consulting, because what you used to do with 10 people in consulting to create all this stuff, now you can still charge for 10 people, but maybe only have 2 people doing that work using more AI. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think most of our jobs are gone long term. I mean, I don't know anything, but that seems like a plausible conclusion based on what's happening. The jobs to probably go last are the jobs that require like intimate conversations between humans. That might be the last thing to go. Sales. A lot of what a physician does today, like 80% of that's probably going to be automated, but the actual talking to a human about something catastrophic in their life, that may not be replaced easily by a robot. And so I think consulting is this weird thing where sometimes, I would say often, consultants will come in to an organization and make recommendations that someone in that organization is already saying. And we call that power of the visitor badge, right? We'd find the people that we think sort of got it, that align with how we think about the world. They're telling their bosses the same stuff we're going to tell their bosses, and we just do it in a different way from an outsider's perspective with a really pretty PowerPoint. Is Is the PowerPoint reproducible by a robot? 100%. Is there recommendation? Probably. Is the ability to like influence a leader in a specific way going to be replaceable? Probably at some point, but that might be like the last thing to go. So I think consulting's here to stay. I don't know if there's going to be a huge boom behind it, but we tend to, I think, overemphasize how much stuff will be automated. I think, like, you know, we put in these massive systems that these big EMRs are coming into to healthcare. AI is coming into healthcare. Do you know how many people are behind the hood on these things? I mean, the administrative layer in healthcare today is insane. So a lot of those jobs will go away over time, but we've been saying that for like 20 years.
Yeah, Taylor, I know you had some questions about healthcare in general.
Yeah, I think what would you tell, let's say there's a young founder who's listening, what would you tell a young person who has a very, very long time horizon? So they're willing to invest, let's call it 20, 30, 40 years, and their vision in their head, and maybe they don't know exactly how to do it, but the vision in their head is that they want to have a very, very positive, big change in healthcare. And I think that maybe to a young person that's not super involved like yourself, or they're not to the level of the career that you're in, it looks insurmountable, and it looks like that healthcare is this big thing that can't be changed. But what if they had a long time horizon, they were willing to work really hard, and they want to start a company? What kind of advice would you give someone like that wanted to make a big positive change?
Probably the biggest problem we're going to have over the next 20 years is straight up labor shortage. We have it right now in nursing. We're going to have a physician. I have a lot of friends of physicians. Many of them call me and tell me that they do not like their job and it's not nearly as rewarding, and they wish they did something else. And I think that's super unfortunate for us as a society, but it doesn't seem to be changing pretty rapidly, which means we are either going to have to figure out how to make the job more enjoyable and train a bunch of new people, and or figure out how to use technology much smarter. I think one of the challenges that we have in probably the Western world in general, we never do less. Right? Think about the last VC-backed tech company that was trying to do it's like, we're all doing more. Layer this new thing on top. You know, $50 billion have went into digital health over the last 5 years. Do you know how many patients schedule an appointment online, which is like the lowest bar? You can do that basically, you know, you can go to any restaurant and from a single platform and book them regardless of what platform they're on. Any guesses?
10%.
It's 2%.
Is it really?
$50 billion on one side, 2% on the other. And so the opportunity here is what I believe some of the fundamental problem is, we don't have a technology problem. We have lots of tech. The tech works just fine. It's like the system is very hard. And so I think if you really want to make change, it's in the system. And so either you're building some fancy tech on the outside, or you're like intimately learning one piece of the system and impacting change there. And the thing about healthcare is so big. Healthcare is like 50 different industries. Like I've never met someone that actually understands how insurance work and also understands how pharma works. Right? I know how the provider space, like how big healthcare systems work. I know zero about med tech devices. I know zero about pharma. And you're in healthcare. It's probably the same thing. Like, do you know the inner workings of a provider?
That's so true. Because we're in this, even YPO has these healthcare, and EO has these healthcare groups, and I joined a few of them, and they're like, oh, let's do a brainstorming session, needs and leads, and I get there, and I'm like, wow, I have nothing in common with these other healthcare people. You're right. It really is like 50 different industries, because I have zero in common with a manufacturer in Korea trying to like get their products in the U.S. I'm like, I have no idea what value I could bring to that conversation.
I do think it's going to take change from inside. Like, you find this in any organization. Healthcare is no different. If you've been in an org for 20 years, it's hard. And I had this experience, right? 400 people, super mission-driven company. Everybody's sort of trying to get to the goal line, make a difference in healthcare, and sort of working towards that end. And then you get into an organization that's 100,000 people, and the mission becomes so esoteric and secondary that you start focusing on what's ahead of you, which is often climbing a ladder or getting to the next promotion. And it's very easy to do. I don't think it's a people problem. I mean, it's part of the system. And so that gets really hard. So I don't have any good answers, but I do think the folks that'll figure something out are, how do we make the physician's life better? How do we get rid of we call it type of licensure? So let the physician focus on the stuff that they went to school for, and then all the other dirty work is done by something else, probably some sort of robot, or work the system from the inside, like get into public health and like we need more people that are like driving to change. It's an unsatisfying answer, I know.
No, that's a great answer. What I hear you saying is that we don't need more tech. We need more people who understand the process and how to make real human change inside these organizations, or structural organizational change, like you're saying. Is that what you're saying?
Totally, yeah. Like, do you know why scheduling is so hard? It's not the tech. So if you want to go to your favorite health system and you want to book an appointment, maybe you have some issues and you need to see a urologist.
I do.
Yeah, so I know. I'm trying not to pick on you.
Thanks
HIPAA violation.
Thanks for bringing it up.
HIPAA violation.
There's usually inside a health system like a couple of people that know how to schedule complex procedures. So now you've got two people. And so let's talk about the tech. You want to go and you want to schedule that appointment online. The challenge is if, John is at lunch, you can't get into urology. So it doesn't matter what tech you layer on top of that. Like John needs to take lunch because he's a human. And that's sort of how the structure has been built over 100 years. You have just this, it's bureaucratic and it's no one's fault. It's just this is how healthcare has sort of evolved. So every specialty kind of has their own practice and is fairly decentralized. And so it's very hard to build tech on top of that sort of process. And so what I believe you have to do is you have to do the much harder stuff, and you have to work politically within a system to help people understand what it could look like if we worked differently together. So what if we didn't have John in urology scheduling something super specific? What if we got all of our complex procedures together and we said, how do we simplify how scheduling works so we can centralize? And so instead of John that just knows urology, John now can work across a bunch of subspecialties. And shoot, if I can get a bunch of people working on a bunch of subspecialties, maybe I can stick them centrally together. And once they're centrally, all of a sudden, I can put an app on top of that thing. So it's like now we can use tech because the foundational layer, like the core operations. And it's super hard because you get into a bunch of hairy stuff about union and hours and how physicians are getting paid. You're up against how things have always worked for 100 years. Like if you want to fix healthcare, that's the stuff you have to actually get into.
I love this answer. Because it's not a satisfying answer, right? It's not that we need Calendly for booking, right?
Totally.
It's that
there's 8 million Calendlys for booking in healthcare right now.
I see. You're saying that's like 1% of the problem.
Totally.
99% is everything you just.
This is a very self-serving answer, by the way, because the company I'm working on now is like a super boring under the hood infrastructure company because this is what we believe.
What a great setup.
No more tech. Just go into your process, because what's happening is, you're here in New York. You've got Village, you've got One Medical, you have a whole bunch of choices now. And the way the business of healthcare works now, you need patients. And so there's a little bit of a war on patients. Like everybody's trying to get the patient, and you have all these new entrants coming in. And so I think patient expectations in some ways are starting to drive how healthcare works. So if you can go on One Medical and get your lab drawn on a Saturday, you might just say, I'm going to do that instead of going to the system I saw for 50 years. So loyalty is really feeble in the healthcare world.
For sure.
Consumers will switch for stuff that's just easier. And so if you're a big health system, one, you better get more competitive. And two, you sort of have to if you're going to drive costs out of this thing and make your system more efficient. And so that's sort of what we believe is the cure to some of this.
Fun fact, I just canceled my One Medical. I tried to schedule an appointment, and anywhere in Manhattan, the next available date was like 3 months from now. And on their website, like the front page was like, schedule same day appointment.
I think you might be running up against the first thing we talked. That we have a pretty severe short labor
and they're
shortage.
Not even, they're nurses and
PAs, yeah,
in those offices. So about changing the system, though, usually a decision maker needs to change their mind, whether it's a physician group willing to take a lower licensure and kind of put their needs second, or a CFO of a system putting the short-term financial interest maybe second to these changes. So like, how do you actually get some of those people to change their mind?
These like public company CEOs who are making like $200 million and everybody complains? I think you're not paying her enough. Like, here's my thesis. The difference between an organization, like a massive organization that's like really competent and can get stuff done and can change and try to disrupt themselves, and the organization that can't, is like 3 people. And I've seen this time and time again. If you have like 3 good people at the top, you can get a lot of stuff done. And if you don't, you're in big trouble. So a little bit of hyperbole. I don't know if 200 million is fair, but I do think leadership matters more than anything else. And so how do you sell? You have to sell at the top. So we have a lot. So we had 170 some large healthcare organizations. So we supported clients that were on the Epic medical record. Epic supports mostly large integrated delivery networks, the largest health systems in the world, and large academics. Like all the names you've ever heard about in U.S. News World Report, top hospitals, those were our clients. There are many clients who have amazing leadership that are thinking about these same changes. And those are our early clients as we think about how do we sort of change healthcare for the better. Then you know the curve, right? You've got your leaders. That comes down to 3 people, I think. Then you've got sort of the middle group, right? The followers that will see the leaders and they'll start to change. And then you've got the laggers who will go out of business or be forced to change when it's almost too late. And so I believe, how do you change? You got to go find the leaders, and that's 2 people, 3 people.
So then, this is great. 2 or 3 people at the top of a $10 billion, health system or organization is, how do you get in front of those people? Well, you have the relationships now, but say you were to start over today with no relationships that you have. You're just like a stranger off the streets, like, I'm going to go do this. How do you get to those people?
Oh, man, that's brutal. I mean, the first startup's hard. 0 to 1 in first startup is almost impossible. How do you get them? Have you ever read Grit by Angela Duckworth? Like, that's how you get them. You get knocked down 8 million times. I fundraised. So I left 18 months ago from my acquirer. I spent a bunch of time doing random stuff. I own a couple behavioral health clinics in the upper Midwest. We bought a tiny sort of focused platform in the behavioral health space, tech platform. So we were fundraising for that. And I've done this before, and my spreadsheet of investors is 170 people. That's 166 no's to get to the 3 yeses. Like, that's sales, right? It's the whole, what are the kids saying? Anti-fragile. It's like, you are going to get knocked down so many times. You're going to eat shit so many times, and you just got to get back up. The first company I ran was a bus company in college. And it was like fairly successful. I went to UW-Madison, and the kids from Minnesota went to Madison en masse because we had reciprocity. So if you were from Minnesota like me, and this UW was like a much worse school by that time, so even I got in. But if you got into UW, you could pay in-state tuition. So there's like thousands of kids that were going across the border, and getting home was such a pain in the ass. Like, have you ever rode a Greyhound?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, talk about a business that needs to go. And so I built
like Amtrak. I thought it was owned by the government.
It's basically the same. So I built this bus company, and it worked. I also tried at like 7 different schools, and I failed in basically all those other schools. But I got this one right. And I don't talk about all this. It doesn't matter. No one even cares. It's like the one time you have a success is the only thing people focus on. So you can fail 8 million times. You can be wrong 8 million times, and all you need is 1 to go. So how do you sell? Like, that's how you sell.
That's great. So you go after these people. You would be relentless in emailing, calling, whatever it takes, send them gifts, finding any mutual, connection. You would be relentless in trying to get in front of those people.
I mean, yeah, that's the game. Now, the truth is, the warm relationship, like the warm handoff, is the thing that matters the most. So the best way you can get sales is just through networking, which is, it's a skill in and of itself. And whether that's how our whole capital structure should be built is sort of a conversation. Like, is that really what we want? It's like, you have to network to get to the right person. And if you're a good network, you're going to win, and not the people with the best product. Like, I don't know if that's good for the world, but that's just how it works. So yeah, networking, I think, is like the key to this game, which is why like the second and third and fourth time just get easier and easier, because you have those connections. It's also, by the way, not to go too controversial,
Let's do it.
It's why DEI is so hard, right? Because basically, who do you hire and who do you sell to? Like, people in your network. And so if you do not have a diverse network, it is very hard to recruit diverse talent. So like, the pipeline matters a lot, because basically all of the world is nepotism. The first probably 50 people we hired were within 1 or 2 connections for us, mostly because we could vet them. Right. Here's like a hot tip. References are totally useless. You were talking about getting in the door. It's like, anybody, including even Flaviu, could find 3 people that would say nice things about him. Mm-hmm. What we found, though, if you let those people off the hook, they might actually tell you the truth. So the hack is, don't call references. That's like a total waste of time. We'd send 1 email, and we'd say, hey, we're evaluating Flaviu for this position. And you worked with them here. If Flaviu is in the top 25% of people you've worked with, please just let us know. If not, feel free to delete the email. And what you do is you totally let people off the hook, right? Plausible deniability, like if you ever talk to them again, like, oh, they just didn't see the email. And so we were like, maybe people aren't going to see the email and there's some risk there. No. If I worked with Flaviu and I thought he was great, I would respond 100% of the time. Like, oh, I love this guy. You should hire him immediately. If I work with someone that's like I might just be like, delete, and move on with my life. And so so going back to the point, most of the people we hired, we were 1-2 degrees of connection from, because I could go ask John if he worked with Flaviu, and John would be like, oh yeah, I like this guy. And if I trust John, Flaviu's in, right? It's like it's a shortcut. And so you get these sort of tight knit networks, which unfortunately, I think it's a good way to evaluate talent, because you're a friend of a friend and you trust this person, but it also creates like these closed loops, which is why I think we have such a diversity problem. So how do you fix that? I think it's a pipeline. It's like, how do you build better systems by which you can evaluate if someone's good? And then 2, if your network is closed and it's a bunch of people that look the same, how do you actually open up that pipeline so you can start networking into other groups? And it's super hard to do.
Yeah, because what is networking? I feel that networking is no longer the same as it was before 2020. Like, practically speaking, meetups or even conferences don't feel the same. More people are more comfortable not going to them. Especially the decision makers, to me, seem to rather stay virtual or in an even tighter. It seems like from my side now, it's just like the CEOs of hospitals might meet with the CEOs of hospital in like a hotel room in LA somewhere on the beach, and that's it. And maybe I'm wrong. I wonder how you view networking. Like, what does networking really mean these days? Yeah, how do you network?
Have you ever read Adam Grant's Give and Take?
No.
So super, super high. So Adam Grant says, he's an organizational psychologist, and he says there are 3 types of people in organizations, like 3 types of behaviors. So he wanted to figure out who are the most successful people in organizations. And to answer that question, you got to figure out, like, how do I even classify people? And so he came up with a system through many interviews, and he basically said there are 3 types of people. There are the matchers, so that's most of us. I will go out of my way to do something for you if you do something for me. The world's in equilibrium, tit for tat. There are the givers, the folks that will do anything for anybody no matter what they get. And then there are the takers. We all know those people in our lives who will throw you under the bus the first opportunity. They're only in it for them. And so then he wanted to figure out who are the most successful people of this group. Who do you think the least successful people are? Givers, matchers, takers.
Takers.
You
The
say
matchers.
takers, you say matchers. You're both wrong. The least successful people are the givers. The people that are going out of their way to be selfless to others are the least successful. So who do you think the most successful are?
Takers.
The
You
match.
say takers. You're both wrong again. It's a trick question. He finds the givers are also the most successful. And the only difference between the givers that are like very successful and the givers that are not is the givers at the bottom just haven't figured out how to not get taken advantage of. Otherwise, they act exactly the same. And the best analogy is, if you're trying to climb a corporate ladder, is it easier to get up if everybody hates you and because you've screwed them over and they're trying to pull you down? Or is it easier to get up if everybody likes you and you've gone out of their way from them and they're pushing you up? And for every asshole you see on the front page of whatever newspaper for doing so, there's like 100 other people behind the scenes that exhibit behaviors that look much more like givers. And so I have like countless examples, and I read this and I was like, this really resonates with me, how I want to run a company. Even how we think about non-competes, like who are we to stand in the way of stuff like that. So we have really skinny non-competes, and it always comes back around. It's sort of the scientific version of karma. And so one of the things Adam Grant talks about, if you don't even have to be a giver, you can just pretend to be a giver and you get all the benefits. So I don't even know where I fall like naturally on the spectrum, but I try to think about how do you act like giver, because I truly believe it benefits you. So going back to your question on networking, my philosophy is literally talk to everybody. Go to every conference, talk to everybody. Even if you don't know if you can help this person or you don't know if you're going to get anything from them, it doesn't matter. Talk to them. I was fundraising the first time around in 2012, and I knew nobody with money. And we were going through whatever, BlackBerry or Palm Pilot or whatever it was at the time, to try to figure out like we were literally raising like $5,000 at the time for the first company. And I knew one guy. This guy I had worked with like 10 years ago, and Epic. Well, I was at Epic, and we were trying to figure out who should we partner with in this, and Epic didn't partner with anybody, formal partnerships anyway. But we decided we needed a formal partnership, and so we went out and found this one company. And I called the CEO. I was like this peon, 22-year-old at Epic, and I was like, "Hey, come to Verona, Wisconsin, and we want to partner with you." And this dude was on the first plane, out to, and I had no idea at the time. I was just like a dumb kid. But we came out, we made this integration work, and I worked my ass off because everybody at Epic worked their butt off, and that was it. And then 10 years later, I'm trying to figure out. I'm like, I know one CEO. Like my entire life, I've met one CEO, and I called this guy up. He's from like cowboy from Oklahoma. I hadn't talked to him in like 7 years probably. And I was like, "Hey, JP, I don't know if you know me," but and he was like, "Yeah." I was like, "I don't know if you remember me." And he was like, "Shit, yeah, I remember you." I'm paraphrasing. He's like, "You made me rich." Wow. They had sold their company. Again, paraphrasing. And he and his business partner each wrote us like $100,000 check in like 2 weeks. And it was the biggest check. I think it was actually the biggest check we raised the entire company. And I was like, why the hell did this dude give us money? Like, I wouldn't give myself money at this point. But I read Give and Take, and I was like, it makes perfect sense. Like, I wasn't expecting this to come around. I was just doing my job and doing what I thought was right. And here I was 10 years later calling on the same guy with no expectation. So I think that's sort of how the world works. So I don't know if you live in New York, and so your people are crazy, but in Florida we're free and we just hang out, So the conferences are like, I was at a conference this week, it was freaking packed. So I kind of feel like everybody forgot, like the buffet was open, No one even, lick your hand, put it in the buffet with your, who knows?
The conferences are back here too. I don't know. Been to a couple in the city. They're pretty crazy.
Forget my conference.
I think it's back, but I do think like pretty much all of life sort of works this way, and so I believe in a lot of life is just dumb luck and timing. And also, if you're sitting on the couch, you're going to have a lot less luck than if you're like out there talking to the person who you got connected to that, you have no idea.
Last question for me. On this note of how the world works, I was reading that you spent some time in South Africa volunteering.
Oh, yeah.
And before deciding to come back and start a business. And I'm wondering, how does volunteering play a role in your life, especially as it relates to business? I think people often can frame, business is all about squeezing the orange and every dollar out of it, and volunteering maybe is the opposite, right? It's more of the giving mentality you were talking about. So I guess, how do you reconcile those two? What do you do this day to kind of feed that volunteering side of you?
Just to go back on the businesses squeezing, Adam Grant would say that's actually not the case at all. And I don't know if you've read Infinite Game, but it's like we think we're like doing this one thing, that like this project we're working on, this business we're working on, but actually this game we're playing goes forever and it never ends. And what's funny is a lot of the folks that were like my fierce competitors back in the day are now like friends of mine and invested in companies. And if you would have told me like I was going to be working with these guys 7 years ago, I'll tell you, they're my arch nemesis. But it's like, life is long, and so we're playing this infinite game that goes on basically forever. So again, if you're always going out of your way to even competitors, like long term, that's going to probably come back. So I think actually business is probably a lot more collaborative than people think. Actually, one more story on that. So we compete. Our biggest competitor is a company called Nordic, which is founded by this guy, couple guys, Mark Bach and Drew Madden. And in the early days when we were still trying to build this like failed tech platform, they didn't really see us as competitors yet. And so we built a little bit of a relationship with Mark. And then we basically pivoted into the staffing firm, and we became like, we're right across town in Madison, Wisconsin, in like the Epic universe, like fierce competitors. And we knew basically nothing. And so we were building this business. It was going super well. We hit, 3 or 4 million, like pretty quickly out of the gate. And, we were like, we're so smart, like kings of the world. And we were hiring all these people. And a very common like early mistake was we overhired. And we didn't understand our business. We didn't understand it was seasonal. It was so seasonal. We didn't really understand cash flow. Hospitals pay you in like 90 days, but people want paychecks every 2 weeks. That causes like a huge issue we didn't quite understand yet. And so we got to the point where we came into the summer, business slowed down, which it turns out that's just how it works. We didn't know that. And we just hired all these people, and we came within like 3 days of missing payroll, which talk about like founder stress, man. I don't think I slept for a week. And we got super desperate. Like we called the banks. Banks didn't try. Early stage startup, no assets. Like we weren't going to get a loan. We called a bunch of our investors. We started thinking like maybe we're going to have to raise money, like emergency money. And then we got so desperate, we called Mark, like our crosstown arch nemesis. And he's like, he's a nice dude. And he was like, oh yeah, we have this problem. Like you're growing. No one trusts the growth. You don't have assets. Like banks won't trust you for years. He's like, call Ivan. and he gives us this like number with Ivan's card on it. Ivan is a receivable factorer, which is they'll give you money based on your AR, which we didn't know was a thing at the time. Now it's like fairly common. And Ivan wired us like $300,000 in like 2 days or whatever it was. And Mark Bakken saved Bluetree, which is like insane because then we became like fierce. That was in the early days. Like they were by far the big. They were 5 years older. They were bigger, but like we were going head to head with them and maybe one other customer, like almost every RFP. Oh, wow. And I was like, man, this guy really screwed up, you know. But here we are, like 10 years later, and you know now we're in the same ecosystem. You know, we talk from time to time, and here I am telling the story everywhere I go, and like that's how karma works, right? He did the right thing. He's running a VC now. He did just fine with his life. So anyway, going back to your question on, I don't think we're squeezing an orange, but from volunteer work. So it was actually before I even started Epic. So the first company was a bus company. I had money coming out of college. I got this job at Epic, and I was like, man, do I really want to like be a corporate stooge like right out of college, you know? And so I called my friend who did semester at sea, and I was like, which is a cruise ship, like for a whole semester in college. So he went to like 100 countries, and I was like, where should I go? And he was like, go to South Africa, go to Cape Town. And I was like, what should I do? And he said, go volunteer for the Amy Beale Foundation. And I was like, great. So first I called up my dad and I was like, hey, I'm not going to start work. I'm going to Africa. And he was like, well, you have to come home and get your passport. So I literally called up Amy Beale Foundation and I was like, hey, I can pay my own way. I just want to like come and work with you guys. And they weren't used to people just showing up that didn't need to. So they were like, cool. So I showed up in Cape Town, and the foundation's insane. So Amy Beale was a young Californian pre-law student who moved to Cape Town during the fall of apartheid to register people to vote. And she was caught up at the wrong place, the wrong time, at an African National Congress rally, ANC, and was in the townships that turned violent. And she was killed in this like tragic event. Her parents started a foundation in her name, and I'll just give you the quick truth and reconciliation story. So Nelson Mandela came to power at this time, right? He was the first black president, and he was the first president after the fall of apartheid. And he basically had this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which basically said, to move forward, we need to understand the past, and the only way to understand the past if we allow grace, so people can tell their stories, regardless of how heinous the stories were. So effectively, if you came forward and admitted everything you did during your time in power, we would let you off scot-free. And that's effectively what Truth and Reconciliation was. So in the spirit of Mandela's Truth and Reconciliation, Amy Beale's parents forgave the 2 people convicted of murdering their daughter and hired them into the foundation. And so I would go into the township and I coach soccer and after school programs. And one of the guys I worked super closely with, his name is Easy Nofamela, nicest guy ever. And I didn't even know he was one of the guys convicted of killing Amy Beale until many months into our relationship. And it taught me a lot because I kind of think a lot of life is dumb luck and timing. And like the biggest predictor of where you're going to end up in life is where you were born. And you can sort of, almost anybody I think is capable of almost anything given their circumstance, which has, I think, given me a little bit more perspective and empathy on life. But that was a wild, wild experience.
Yeah, it's nuts.
Yeah, it was crazy. I showed up at this school in Guguletu. Like Guguletu is one of the townships, right? It's you can't imagine the living situation. And I walked into school that had running water and power, and that was about it, right? Just bare bones classrooms with rickety desks, and that was basically it. And then one of the schools had this like super high tech guarded building that I'd never seen anybody go in. So I asked the president or the principal of the school, I was like, what is this thing? And he said, one of the big whatever telcos donated this computer lab. And I was like, why is anybody using it? He goes, no one knows how to use computers. And I was like, I know how to use computers. I have very few skills in life. So he lets me in, and it's a high-tech computer lab. And I'm like, this is going to be great. So I developed a whole curriculum, and I'm like, I'm going to teach all these kids how to type. I had my first class, and I realized that using a mouse is a learned skill. So I had planned this whole thing. We're going to open Word. No one knew how to open Word because they'd never. So I had to scrap the whole thing for the younger kids, and we built a class like in Microsoft Paint, where I was just teaching them how to like really foundational basics. Again, like we're all sort of product of our circumstances. It was crazy.
It's amazing.
Amazing story.
Anything else, Taylor?
I think it's a great place to end.
Great.
Thanks for coming
This is
on,
super
man.
fun, guys.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah,
Really
thanks for doing
appreciate
this. I'm glad I get to share my wisdom with all 11 of your listeners.
Thank you for rocking with the homies. Taylor, Trusty, and Flaviu. Seize the day, own it. Until next time, hold it down, hold it down. Hey.